move over to some wide receivers. I want to stay on the Rams. These are start sits at the position. Cooper Kupp's the first name on our list. He was disappointing last week, only 3 receptions for 11 yards, but he did have 9 targets. This is his first real stinker week of the season. Maybe week 1 with only 4 for 40, but Steph, what are we doing with Cooper Kupp? In my opinion, you roll him out there every single week. He's seeing 80-90% of snaps every single game. The 9 targets were still there in this one. He dropped a touchdown. He barely got turned around on a deep ball that could have gone for a long touchdown. So, in my opinion, Cooper Kupp is locked into my lineup. Don't overreact and put him on your bench just yet.
What's crazy is that Cooper Kupp ended 2019 as the wide receiver 4 on the year. I think those days are probably behind him. Part of that is just the offense in general. You know, we saw Robert Woods. Like, Robert Woods is a wide receiver 1 right now. And that's what we said before the season. It was just like, volume-wise, skill set-wise, we just don't think Cooper Kupp, unless he's getting a ton of touchdowns, he's not going to be a guy that you want to start in fantasy. But you're right. That upside is still there. We've seen him have the big weeks. He had that 25-point game against Buffalo, 17 points against the New York Giants. Against Chicago, which is a tough matchup for wide receivers, you still have to plug him in there because for all we know, McVay's, sitting right now in his mansion in LA scheming up, hey, this is a Cooper Kupp game. We want to get him involved. We want to get him in the end zone, in the red zone. So for those reasons, you have to start Kupp. It's just one of those situations where he's going to give you a lot of volatility. Some weeks he's going to give you 5. Other weeks he's going to give you 25. You never really know when they're going to come. Like, you might look at the matchup and think it's good, but the matchup is no guarantee on what his production is going to look like. You're hoping for the touchdown with him, but he is a guy that does score a lot of touchdowns. Kupp is just a guy that I'm not valuing. Like, people are probably going to overvalue him based on name height, based on the good weeks that he's had this season. I've now dropped him down to a low-end wide receiver 2, which is about where he is. He's the wide receiver 24 on the year. So let's talk about a start-sit decision that's been keeping me up at night almost every single week. And the 2 players here are Brandin Cooks and DJ Chark. I'm leaning towards the Chark side. Starter sit DJ Chark after a pretty disappointing outing in week 6. He didn't kill you, but only 11.5 fantasy points. That's coming off a 4-point week in Houston. He did get hurt in the 4th quarter, but that was the 4th quarter. We've seen a really low target volume thus far in the season, but Chark is coming off a 14-target game. He just wasn't able to get into the red zone. He wasn't able to get a ton of yardage. How do you feel about DJ Chark, and would you start him over Brandin Cooks this week?
Oh, this is tough.
Cooks is against Green Bay. Chark is against the Chargers.
This is a really tough one. To me, I think I would like to start both. I think they're both good flex options, maybe even wide receiver 2 options. And this is going to sound crazy, but I think I would go with Brandin Cooks. I think I would lean with Brandin Cooks and ride that hot hand in Houston. Since Bill O'Brien has been gone, this is what's interesting to me. It's one thing to see Cooks with this low target volume with that 0-point week in week 4. And then you see the last 2 weeks, 12 targets, 9 targets, 8 for 161 and a touchdown, 9 for 68 and a touchdown. It's one thing to say, okay, the status quo is the same, nothing has changed, and Cooks had a couple of hot games. But to me, the fact that Bill O'Brien is now gone and then Cooks all of a sudden is emerging as this top wide receiver, to me, that is more substantial than if everything was the same, because I think Brandin Cooks is truly emerging as the number 1 on this team, and I don't think that can be ignored. I mean, 83% of snaps, 88% of snaps in the last 2 games.
Over Will Fuller.
Cook's snap counts have been through the roof this season. I mean, he and Fuller are essentially the 1A, 1B on this team. To be fair, okay, maybe him and Fuller are about even, but if you're willing to roll out Will Fuller, I think you have to be willing to roll out Brandin Cooks. The targets are there, the snaps are there. Deshaun Watson is obviously an elite quarterback, and they're playing the Green Bay Packers in a game where I expect them to have to throw the ball. So I'm going to lean with Brandin Cooks on this one. Now, I will say I don't think DJ Chark is a bad option. He did see 14 targets last week against Detroit, only turned that into 7 receptions for 45 yards. The Jaguars are spreading the ball around a lot this season. Keelan Cole's been really involved, Laviska Shenault. And at the end of the day, it's close, but the matchup to me is better for Cooks. The quarterback is better for Brandin Cooks, and he's on a hot streak right now. So I think you have to ride that out and roll the dice.
Yeah, it's like the Chase Claypool situation. Fool me once, shame on me. Fool me twice, shame on me. Fool me 3 times. It's not going to happen. So I probably botched that one worse than George Bush. But regardless here, the thing about DJ Chark is that he has all the kind of peripheral statistics. So while the box scores may not be massive, he's had that one boom week. he's still on a team that throws the ball fourth most in the NFL on a per game basis. He's also second amongst all wide receivers right now in red zone targets. I think it's only a matter of time before the rubber meets the road with Chark and he returns back to a little bit more of what he was last season, a more consistent start. I know some of the injuries here might eat into this upside a little bit, and that may have been why we saw a lower yardage total even on those 14 targets. He only caught half of them, but even then he only put up 6.4 yards per catch. So 7 catches for 45 yards. It's not great there. You want to see more than that, especially from Chark, where a lot of what he does is get those deep receptions. Where he was making his hay is, going up and get it downfield. So when you see things like that, it is a little bit concerning, but I'm nowhere near as concerned for Chark as I am with a guy like Juju in that way, even though they're kind of seeing the same problem here. But those 14 targets can't be ignored. I think Chark's going to be relied upon. It's just one of those things where, again, just like Cooper Kupp, there's a level of volatility to expect with the other options emerging. And one you didn't throw out there is James Robinson, because James Robinson's seeing a lot of targets as well. So, it's just something where the distribution is a little bit farther out. But to see 14 targets, anytime you see double-digit targets from a wide receiver, I think you got to go back to the well and plug them back in. But I think you're right. I would go Brandin. You've convinced me, I should say.
It doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel good.
It doesn't feel good to say Brandin Cooks over DJ Chark this week. But you look at the matchup, the Packers versus the Texans, it is the highest over-under on the week, a 57-point over-under.
57. It's up to 57 now. Wow. It moved past Detroit, Atlanta. So wow.
It's supposed to be, for all intents and purposes, a high-scoring game. We'll see if it actually shakes out that way. I feel like, a lot of these games this year where we've expected these really high point totals, you've been a little bit disappointed, whereas all the other games that we didn't expect to be high-scoring have kind of done the opposite. But regardless, I think you're right. And you made great points there on Brandin Cooks. And it was a guy that I took some shots on in some places in drafts this year because the wide receivers that break out typically come from, ambiguous depth charts. You don't know if there's a clear one. Is it a 1A, 1B? You don't really know, and that's what Brandin Cooks is. We know Brandin Cooks is good when he's healthy. He had that year last year where he had the concussion issues, the neck issues with the Rams, but now that he's come back, he looks like the receiver that he's been on 3 different other teams where he's put up 1,000 yards on those different teams and in those seasons. So I think you're right. I think you do have to plug in Brandin Cooks, and anytime there's that upside, whether it's the Will Fuller upside, whatever we want to call it, Brandin Cooks could be a guy who gets 2 deep balls and takes them for touchdowns, especially late in the game. If this is a shootout with Green Bay, you're going to want to have Brandin Cooks in there. And for, if Chark goes off on my bench, I think I'm going to be all right with it after some, disappointing outings the last 2 weeks. Whereas if Brandin Cooks goes off on my bench again, I'm going to be kicking myself because now that's the 3rd week that he's exploded. Luckily, did have him in some lineups last week. So I think I'm going to ride the hot hand here out of these 2 with Cooks, but I think both are starts if we're talking start-sit. Don't fade either one. Cooks, thinking he's going to return to earth, or DJ Chark seeing these last 2 weeks and thinking that he's going to bust again. I think both can have great weeks here in week 7. Now let's talk about a rookie wide receiver, Jeudy, coming off a pretty disappointing performance against the Patriots last week. He only caught 2 of his 5 targets for 32 yards, 5.2 fantasy points. Totally crapped your week if you started him. And the interesting thing with Jeudy is that, and really this whole Broncos offense, is that the defense is what's winning them games this year. And Drew Lock doesn't need to pass. Drew Lock had less than 25 pass attempts in this game because their defense is winning them games. So shout out to Vic Fangio and Ed Donatel, the defensive coordinator, because right now...
Huge win over New England. What an upset.
Right now, the Broncos offense is 28th in the league in points scored, but their defense is putting up 22 points a game, and they're in the top 12 in terms of fewest points allowed this season. So that defense, even with Von Miller hurting out, a couple other injuries they've had, is really, really good. I don't have a ton of faith in Jeudy this week. He's going up against Kansas City. I think in this game you're hoping for garbage time or them to be in comeback mode. I think it could definitely happen here, but it's supposed to be a pretty low-scoring game. The over-under is only 46, so Vegas thinks this is going to be pretty low-scoring. I think the Chiefs will dominate them, and the Chiefs' defense hasn't been a slouch either, especially against wide receivers. So your hope is that the volume's going to be there because of the comeback mode, and what we're actually seeing is that Tim Patrick, this guy that nobody expected, has just absolutely exploded and really shown to be the wide receiver 1 in this offense without Cortland Sutton. So it's something where for Jeudy, I think season long, he's still a hold. He's still a guy who's going to have big weeks. I think it's only a matter of time before he breaks out like some of the other rookie wide receivers that we're seeing. But against Kansas City, I don't want to start him. Do you?
No, I'm with you. I think this one's pretty easy. You just can't start Jeudy right now. You look at his season, and he's done nothing necessarily spectacular. I mean, here's his PPR point totals. 9, 10, 10, 14, where he had a 38-yard touchdown reception that saved his week, and 5. So with Drew Lock and everything you laid out about this offense, you can't start Jeudy right now. This one's easy. Keep him on your bench. I think maybe we could see a breakout later if Drew Lock gets going again back from his injury. If Jeudy can start to pick things up as well as a rookie, maybe we see this Broncos offense improve. Right now, you're keeping Jeudy on your bench.
All right, last wide receiver we'll talk about here, a guy that, oh man, was so disappointing. I had him in my lineup on Monday Night Football. It was too late. I didn't have any other options. I had to play him up against Stephon Diggs. That went horribly for me because it's Michael Gallup. He has Washington this week, coming off that horrible performance from really the entire Cowboys offense and defense. Only 4.3 fantasy points in that game. He had 6 targets, caught 2 of them for 23 yards. We saw back-to-back kind of goal line fades that Gallup ran, and they looked to him both times. That is what gives me confidence for Gallup season long. But are you willing to start him against Washington?
No.
Who is number 1 against wide receivers right now?
Steph, you know why Washington's number 1 against wide receivers?
Because you can run all over them?
Because everyone can run it on them, get a 14-point lead, and not need to throw the ball for the rest of the game. And after what we saw from Andy Dalton last week, I wouldn't be surprised to see the Cowboys do the same thing with Ezekiel Elliott. And no, I'm not really willing to start Gallup this week. I'm trying to look for other options if I can. Now, there's always the chance he goes for that big 50-yard touchdown play. He's truly boom or bust. He's only getting, 5-6 targets a game so far this season, 34 targets in 6 games. So you're really just hoping for that big play that goes for a touchdown. It could happen against Washington, but after what we've seen this season, I mean, he's had one big week, so I'm definitely not going to bank on it this week. He is seeing snaps. He's seeing even 81% of snaps last week was his lowest on the season, so he's out there just about all the time. But with Andy Dalton and all these options, Amari Cooper, CeeDee Lamb seems to be the number 2 target for this offense. Then you got Dalton Schultz in the mix and Zeke, who's going to run the ball all over Washington. I don't see myself starting Michael Gallup this week. Sure, in a deeper league, maybe a 3 wide receiver or a 2 flex league, you throw him out there and hope for that upside. But I'm trying to avoid if possible.
He might be worth a buy low, especially in the deeper leagues like you're talking about. I mean, that defense in Arizona that they went up against is actually a very good defense. They're allowing they're top 5 in points against this year. So they're not allowing any offenses to really get going on them, which is a complete contrast to last year for the Arizona Cardinals. Their defense has stepped up. I think they're going to actually be a sneaky team, a playoff team potentially, that could make a run if they get hot at the right time. But I still think Gallup, because of the targets that he's going to get, it's actually been better with Andy Dalton in the lineup. Granted, it's only a 2-game sample size, and one of those, Dak was in for about, a quarter and a half. But we are seeing a little bit more of a higher target share with Andy Dalton in there. But you're right. He's not really a guy that you want to start. But again, in deep leagues, I think he's worth a buy low, maybe even as a trade throw-in, as a guy who could have some boom weeks later on in the year. The schedule opens up a lot for Dallas down the stretch.